Okay, we're going to learn the eighth chapter of the Metzia. Okay, the chapter begins by talking about the rules of a shoel. Okay, so let's just review for a minute. The shomrim, we should know this by heart already, right? We have the shomer chinam, we have the shomer sachar, and we have the shoel. Okay, shomer chinam is the most lenient because he's watching the object, not getting paid. So he's pretty much exempt from everything, barring negligence. Shomer Sachar is caught in the middle, where because he's getting paid for his service, his liability is a little bit greater. So he's chayav, he's guilty if he doesn't watch it and there's theft. Okay, Geneva ve'aveda. And the shoel, okay, that's what we're going to talk about now, is always liable. He's chayav on everything. Okay, because after all, he gets the object for no cost, and he's not just watching it, he's using it. Okay, and that's a real big difference in the world of Shomrim between the Shomer Chinam, Shomer Sachar, and the Shoel. A Shomer, by definition, is not really allowed to touch the item. In fact, when they take a shvua at the end, if something happens, so they have to actually swear that shalosh shalachti bayad, that I was the custodian, I was watching your object, and I did not lay a hand on it, right? So that by definition is what a shomer does. A shomer watches, right, looks but don't touch. The shoel is the opposite. The whole purpose of the she'ela is for you to actually use the object, right? Why else would I want to borrow this object if not to use it? Right? So that's the difference between a shoel. Now, we said a minute ago, a shoel is chayav on everything. So our perek opens up by discussing the concept of balavimo. There are two exceptions, right? Two rare cases where the shoel is pater. Okay? One of them is discussed at length in the daf that we had on Shabbos, on Sunday, yesterday, today, which is called Bailav Ima. Okay, the Mishnah starts off by saying, let me just read it over here. We're on the bottom of Tzadik Dalid Amud Aleph, 94a on the bottom. Hashoel asapara v'sha'al ba'aleh ima usachar ba'aleh ima. Okay, so I ask you to borrow, in this case, an animal, and at the same time, not only am I borrowing the animal, I am borrowing the owner of the animal. How do you borrow a person? Well, there's two ways of doing it. He could either be working for you, right, for a fee, or he could be working for you for free. He could be doing a service for you. He could be helping you. Either way, you have the object and you have the owner of the object. Okay, or the Mishnah continues, Shal habayla musachan v'achakach shal hapara. Or you do the opposite. You don't first ask to borrow the animal. You ask for the person to help you for free or work for you. And then at the same time, you ask for the object, for the para. And the Mishnah says, umesa. And obviously, we know the end of the story. The animal drops dead. Patur shenamar im balav imo lo yishalem. Mishnah says that you are patur because the pasuk says im balav imo. If the owner is imo, okay, we'll see what that means. With him in some capacity. Mishnah ends off by saying on Tzadik Daled Amud Beis, Aval Shal Lasapara, Yachakach Shal Lasabailim. What if you first ask for the para and then later on in a different transaction, you ask the owner for his service to either work for you for free or for a fee? Okay, that is not considered balavimo if it was done at a different time. So the takeaway from the Mishnah is that it has to be done at the same time, and it doesn't matter the order, but the trigger event is when you have the animal to you and the service of the owner of the animal to you commenced at the same time. Okay. So that's really, in a nutshell, this concept of bilavimo. Okay. So that's one way the shoel is exempt. Remember, we said there's two ways of a shoel being putter. The second way is what we discussed today. If you did today's daf on Sadi Zion, is Mesa Machmas Malacha, okay, which is it literally means the animal dies from the work it performs. And there's a lot of discussion what the word machmas means. Is it is it bishas malacha, right? What if it dies after because it worked too hard, but it didn't die exactly as it was working? It died an hour later. So there are discussions amongst Rishonim and Achronim what exactly mesa malacha means. But basically, the the logic the logic to Mesa Machmas Malacha is what the Rishonim call there was something wrong, Shia, from the Mashal's part. The Mashal had no business giving you an animal that couldn't do what you wanted it to do. You wanted to borrow an animal, okay? And the Gemara says you didn't want to put it in a cradle, right? You didn't want to put it in bed. You wanted to work with it. So if the owner gave you something that wasn't capable of doing what your intention was to do with it, then it's his problem. It's not your problem. So, in a nutshell, again, there's more discussion about Mesamach Malacha, but I wanted to focus on this concept of Balavimo because the truth is it's a very, very strange concept. And what's interesting is that the Mishnah brings the source for it. The Gemara doesn't talk about where the source of it is. The Mishnah actually introduces it by saying you're potter because it says im balavimo eno mishalim. So that's one important point. The second important point is that the Gemara actually has an opinion of Rav Hamnuna on Sadi Hey Amud Beis, where Rav Hamnuna argues and he says, I'm just going to read it quickly. La'olam hu chayav ad she'apar v'chorish b'chamor machamer akareha. Rav Huna says, I don't buy that you're telling me that all you need is to hire the owner, okay? And then you have nothing to worry about. The owner actually has to do work with the object that died, with the animal that died, right? The whole chiddush of Balavimo is even if the owner was doing something else. For example, you borrowed a snow shovel, okay? And you realize that you aren't strong enough to shovel the snow. So not only did you borrow the shovel, you borrowed the owner to help you. You either paid him a fee or you didn't pay him a fee. So Bailavimo says that if you're working and he's helping you and the shovel breaks, okay, you're exempt. Okay? That's what Bailavimo says. What also Balavimo says is that if you borrow the person's shovel, okay, to shovel your driveway, and the person, instead of shoveling with you, is fixing your boiler in the basement 2 miles away in your guest house, okay, you're still exempt if the shovel breaks, right? Now, that's a little bit, more far-fetched, but that's also an extension of Balavimo. Rav Hamnuna actually doesn't hold of that. Rav Hamnuna says you actually have to be working, or the owner, what we call the mashil, has to be working with the animal in order for this to trigger. Okay, so this really sounds like one big loophole, right? Almost like I have advice for you. If you want to borrow something and you want to be exempt, if something happens and you don't want to be responsible, then the Torah gives you a way out. And in fact, today's daf, I'm not sure if you saw it yet, on Daf Tzadi Zayin, says a very similar line. It says, Amar Rava, I'm reading from 97a, about halfway down. Amar Rava, Haiman debayla mishal midim mechare v'liftar. If I want the best of both worlds. I want to borrow something free of cost, get all the use out of it, right? Could you imagine that? And not be responsible if something happens. It's like renting a car for free. And you don't have to pay for mileage. and you're exempt from accident. You get everything in your favor. So what's the trick? Rava says, I'll give you advice. Namely, Ashkin Maya, Davishela Babaylim. Say, can I borrow your $75,000 BMW for a few hours? I want to drive it around the neighborhood. Oh, and by the way, when you bring the car over, can you just pour me a cup of water? Right? So says the Gemara, that is a way of exemption. You smack up the car. Technically, it's a case of Baila Vimo because the owner was borrowed to you at the same time when he was delivering the car, right? To lend to you. Even though he's not in the car, he has nothing to do with the car, he's getting you water, he's fixing your boiler, he's doing something else for you, right? The Gemara actually says he could even teach you, right? Something. So that's a case of Balavima. And the Gemara ends off by saying, V'pikeachu nemole shal bereisha v'hadar ashken maya. If this mashil ever learned Daf Yomi, he would know that something's up. So he's going to say, yeah, I'll give you my car, and 2 hours later, I'll bring you water. So if it's not done simultaneously, then as we learned, that evades this loophole of Bailavima. So we use the word loophole. Now, is that fair? It's a halacha, right? So in order to understand this law, it's very important to go to the source of the law. Okay, so Tosfos, right, on Daf Tzadi Vav, Amud Aleph 96a, the third Tosfos, on the left side, has a discussion about what if I have partners, I have two partners, and one of them is Bailavimo, does it take effect for the whole partnership? The Tosfos makes a comment and says that aval she'ela b'bailim ain't svarali pater v'havi kechidish ve'ein lecha bo ela chidusho. Tosfos throws up his hands, so to speak, and says we can't compare she'ela b'bailim to any other case, right? We can't ask any other questions, right? Because the Gemara the Tosfos brought a question about partners and in Mesachas Bava Kama. It says no, we can't ask. When it comes to Sheila B'Bailim, it's almost like we use the word chok, like by the para aduma, right? You're not allowed to ask any questions. It doesn't make sense. So it's a chok. Tosfos uses the word chiddush, right? We say the word chiddush sometimes. Chiddush is something that I never would in a million years, right, figure out, right? One of the classic Gemaras is like, for example, an Eid Zomim, right, as a chiddush, right? When the second set of witnesses, right, disqualifies the first set of witnesses. Like, why do we listen to the second set? How do we know they're telling the truth, right? Why does the last set of witness always win, right? Basar b'chalav, right? The Gemara in Chulin says is a chiddush because, right, right, the fact that milk is kosher by itself, meat is kosher by itself. You decide to put them together in a pot with heat. Right, that doesn't make any sense. So that's a chiddush. So this is also a chiddush. This is you can't ask any questions. So that's the way the accepted, you know, the majority of explanations as to this rule about Bailavimo. But as we always do, we're going to look at the Sefer HaChinuch. Because whenever we want to find, you know, reasons and answers and explanations, the chinuch is usually helpful. So let's see what the chinuch has to say about the concept of Bailavimo. And in fact, number 60, right, in the list of 613 is the mitzvah of being a shoel. Okay? Well, it's not a mitzvah to be a shoel. It's a mitzvah, which this is a whole separate discussion about why it's called a mitzvah, but the mitzvah is if you're in a situation, right? I'll read from the chinuch, number 60. Klomar Adam sheshal mechaver shum chayfetz obehema v'hasheilihi below schar klal eleshen ischaser imo lasot lo tova v'achar kach im nafal machlokas b'neihem al davar. Right? the intention was good, like everything else. Everything starts out good, and bam, something happened at the end, right? He borrowed it, it went missing. Now they have a lawsuit. Okay, so now they go to court and they point fingers. This is the mitzvah of the court dealing with a shoel. Okay, so the chinuch goes on. I'll skip a little bit. He says that the shoel let's talk about this concept of bailavimo. He goes right to it in the beginning. So I understand a little bit, says the Sefer HaChinuch, about this concept, because after all, why should the shoel be responsible if the owner of the object was next to the animal that he was borrowing? That makes sense. The Mekivan Shehusham Yishmar Hu Es Shalo. The owner is near the ox that he lent out, so therefore he's what we'd say a shtickle responsible. Okay? Mekivan Shahayu Sham, I'm sorry. So he said, Mekivan Shehusham Yishmar Hu Es Shalo Ve'afal Pi. So now the Chinuch asks the obvious question, because the Gemara goes out of its way to say that it doesn't really matter what the owner is doing. He could be in the field working with you with the animal, or he could be 2 miles away fixing your boiler. It doesn't really matter. And that's exactly the question that the Chinuch asks on himself, because he provides an explanation, but the explanation, unfortunately, is incomplete. So he has to say, even if the Baal left the premises, right? As long as they were there initially, that's when the trigger was, that's when it started. So how do you explain that? So so he gives a little bit of what we call a dochek answer. Not such a satisfactory answer, but all you could say is the way the Chinuch explains is that the Torah doesn't want to give like, well, he has to be there for 10 minutes. He has to be there for 30 minutes. He has to be there for 75 minutes, right? You don't want to be nitty gritty about the details of how long he has to be there, right? So the Lomar, imishu sham bailam harbe yehi pater hashoel, b'ma'at yeheh chayav. The Torah can't say, well, if he's there for a long time, then okay, he'll be chayav. If he's there for a short time, then it's not fair. Why should bailavimo apply, right? He wasn't working with the animal for such a long time, but it's all arbitrary. What one person thinks is a long time could really be a short time. So therefore, it's a classic case of lo nitna Torah l'shiurin. It's impossible to give measurements, right? It's all relative at the end of the day. So therefore, b'tzifta haTorah derech klal the kol ha'bailim sham b'shat. Therefore, the yehei pater, right? So that's why the only fair way is to say, as long as you're there at the time when it started, then you are pater for bailavim. Okay, so that's the way the Chinuch explains it. Now, what I want to highlight over here, it's a very interesting, phenomena that I noticed, is that the Gemara really doesn't talk about the svara or the reason, right, of a lot of things. In fact, Tosfos, we just said a few minutes ago, said it's a chiddush, and I have no idea, says Tosfos, why it works. But what's interesting is if you look in the commentators in what we would call the parshanim, right? It's almost like if you learn Parshas Mishpatim without a Bava Metzia in front of you, you would get a different impression. And we see this a lot of times where the Parshanim, right, look and they analyze a pasuk, but they do it on its most basic level. The Gemara likes to turn things over and use thumbs and do all kinds of hocus pocus, right, and make drushes and turn things right around, something that we'll never ever see. If we learn the pasuk 1,000 years, you'd never figure it out. But and I'm going to show you a perfect example, okay? And this is really, really hits home. because if you learn the way the Ibn Ezer, okay, which is when you talk about like pashtanim, right? Just the simple, and we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago about ein hamikra yotze midei pshuto. If right, we say that it's very, very important not to overlook the simple meaning, right? Only one time in regarding Yibum, we make an exception, but 99.9% of the time, you have to understand and assume that the literal translation of the pasuk holds water. So if that's true, okay, then how do you explain Bailavimo without the fancy Gemara in front of us? So you ready for this? So the Ibn Ezer says, you know what this means? Says the Ibn Ezer, al derech hapshat, bailav einimo. In most cases, where I borrow the ox, right, where I borrow the animal, and the owner of the animal doesn't come along with it, right, on most of the time, right, you are chayav v'yachol liton al hashoel shehichbid al behemto, meaning the owner can claim what? That the animal died because, hey, I give you a good animal, you overworked it. I wasn't there to see it, right? I wasn't watching over it. So if I wasn't there, then therefore you as a shoel are responsible. Okay, now what's the flip side of this? That's where a case of no bailavimo. What does bailavimo mean in the world of the Ibn Ezer? You know what bailavimo means? Im shehu ra ba'atzmo ech nishbar omes. If the owner, it doesn't necessarily mean like our Gemara. Like again, my point is you would never know just by reading the Ibn Ezra that the Torah means that you hired the owner to do something for you, or you asked him to do a favor for you, either for a fee or without a fee. And even if he's doing something else, here we have a classic case of the pshat, the ein hamikra yotze midei pshuto. The literal translation is that you borrowed the animal, and the way the Ibn Ezra explained, if the owner came with it, then he could see for himself how the animal got hurt or died. So therefore, more often than not, you're going to be putter, right? That's the way the Ibn Ezra explains. Not because it's a xeros hakasuv that if you hired him and we don't know the reason. He says if he was there, then he could see that if the animal died, it really shouldn't be your fault, right? Even though a shoel is chayav all the time, but if the owner isn't there, then the owner will never see or be satisfied that you didn't do anything bad or malicious to injure or kill the animal. So I thought that's a excellent example of how you see now the Ibn Ezra lived in thousand like 400 or 500 years after the Gemara was finished. So whether or not the Ibn Ezra saw the Gemara, he probably did, but his job is to explain the psukim the way the simple interpretation is, and that's the way the Ibn Ezra explains. The Chezkuni, which is very similar to the Ibn Ezra, says im bailav shel behema im hashol b'shas misa lo yishalem shum davar lefi shera shenahagi mo karaui. It's almost like logical. If I give you the animal, okay, and you're using it, and me as the owner tag along, and I'm working with it with you, and the animal drops dead, right? Says the Chizkuni, if I am a reasonable person and saw that the animal died, you didn't overwork it, you didn't malnourish, you didn't not feed it, you didn't do anything crazy, you didn't put it out in the freezing temperature, you worked it normally, and it died, then most reasonable people would say, okay, that's it. We just got unlucky. It died. I'm not going to hold you responsible. But the owner actually has to be there. That's the way the Chizkuni explains it. The Sforno, on the other hand, gets very, very technical. He says, Lo yishalem, shestam mashil bekorov das kazeh hu noten matana al das sheyachzir. The way the Sforno sets up Bailavimo is that he he says under most circumstances, under most of the time, the animal was lent out with a almost like a matana almanas lahachzir. Okay, you could look at every single she'ela, and we spoke about this in the beginning. Why she'ela? You're a different kind of shomer. But what do you do when you borrow something and you return it? It's like, right, the way we get around if there's only one esrog in town, right? So what do you do? And it's not yours. So someone gives it to you. It's called the matana manas lahachzir. It's yours for 25 seconds, but it's only yours as a present on the condition that you give it back to the owner, right? Now you're being yod to the mitzvah of lulav and esro, great, kind of in a loophole way because it's not really yours, but you're borrowing it. Even though you can't borrow it, it's yours, so to speak, for about 25 seconds, and then you give it back. So that's what the she'ela is, says the Sforno. Because this is a matana almanas lahachzir, the kivin shalo hisne, and because there was no tanai over here, eno chayiv lahachzir ela kishehi nimtzat be'ein, right? So therefore, you only have to return it, right? Right? You don't have to return it only when it is still living. Shafilo ladasa omer. Okay, so he goes on. I'm just going to read it in English because it's a very lengthy one. He says, when one makes this kind of gift, one does not draw up a list of conditions pertaining to the precise use the gift may be made of. If such a list of conditions has indeed been drawn up, the nature of and the entire transaction would have been nullified. It would no longer be classified as a temporary gift at all, but the owner would remain effectively the borrower, so that non-return, even deliberately, would not constitute a dereliction resulting in his being entitled to compensation. The presence of the owner during any accident, right? This is the punchline. This concept of bailavimo, which had befallen the loaned animal, is taken by the Torah as proof that he had never relinquished any part of his ownership. Meaning, here's the animal, I'm helping you out, but you're not really doing anything. It's my animal. I'm not giving it to you. It's not a matana almanas lahachzir because I'm here helping the animal. Hence, he is not entitled to compensation. One does not get compensation for losing what belongs to one, right? That's the punchline. He says, because usually a she'ela is a matana almanas lahachzir, but here, this is not a matana almanas lahachzir because I am working with the item that I gave you. So that I thought was a very interesting. So again, we have this law, and everyone is bending over backwards to figure out a reason why or what kind of logic is. Here's a great one from the Ralbag. The Ralbag says, right? No matter what happens, if the Baal isn't with him, you have to pay no matter what. But what's the reason? The owner, the real owner, the mashil, is, so to speak, tachas yado. He is in this place of, right? He's in the place of the shoel at the time of the she'ela. Hine lo yitachen sheyishtabed lo zeh as b'shmirat habehema. So therefore, it doesn't make sense that there should be some kind of shibud. Shibud is roughly translated as like a lien or a to subjugate, right? I can't have a shibud, right? By making you watch this animal, kimin hasheker, because it's a lie. What's a lie? That sheyeh ha'adam eved ve'adon yachad le'ish. That's the key word over here. It's a lie for a person to wear two hats. On the one hand, I'm an eved to you, so to speak, because after all, I'm doing a job for you, whether I get paid or not. So I can't be an eved and an adon yachad le'ish. I can't at the same time, it's like two forces that oppose each other, right? I saw the Torah Tamima has a very similar lashon. I can't have a cross shibud. I can't have on the one hand that I am meshubed to you and you are meshubed to my animal. It doesn't work. It cancels each other out, right? I can't be an eved, right, to work for you and an adon and an owner of the animal that's in your hands now. All right. So he goes on, and it's a very, very long Ralbag, but I saw something even greater. You could believe that. Just when you thought it was overload, I saw a hemek davar. I saw a nitziv. The nitziv says, "In bailav imo, if the owner is with you, the ein derech levakesh gemach mechavero." So the Netziv says, think about the situation. Isn't it an odd situation for someone to not only give you his animal, okay, for free, and to work for you and to help you? He says, that's not normal. This must be some kind of really special relationship you have, right? Again, two people, right? The Shoel has a very, very special relationship in the Mashil that they have a history together. All right. So therefore, because this is a unconventional relationship, right? The imken hashe'elat habehema gamken lo mikre kol hanaz shalo. Therefore, the Shoel no longer wears the hat of Kol Hanashalo. What is Kol Hanashalo? Kol Hanashalo is the expression that the Gemara used, if you remember, a couple days ago, to explain why the Shoel has the most stringent laws out of all the Shomrim. Because after all, he gets to use it, and it's free, right? Think about it, right? Your friend giving you something for free to use, right? Yeah, I'll borrow my car for the week. Great. I don't have to pay you. So because you have everything going in your favor, the responsibility is the highest out of all the Shomrim. Here, it's not called Kol Hana Shalom because there's some kind of a relationship where they've done business before. Maybe a week before this, the Shoel did something to the Mashil, right? And this goes back to why I say sometimes when you learn the Parshanim on the Chumash, aside from our Gemara, it gives you I'm teaching Mincha a half hour ago, right? Excuse me. So, sometimes you get a different flavor and a different understanding of, oh yeah, let's talk like reality, right? The Gemara would never give you this kind of a reason. This is more of a, this is more of a, well, let's analyze the situation that the psukim talk about, right? Why do you think someone would ever lend himself to work for you for free and give you his animal? You must have some kind of great relationship. So therefore it's not called Kol Hana Shalo because you've done this in the past and maybe the roles were reversed, right? And you lent him something. And therefore the two words that the Nitziv uses at the end, Lo Yishalem She'eno Shoel. You know what the punchline is? Because it's a case of Bailav Imo, the Nitziv says, you don't even have a ruling of a Shoel. You're not a Shomer. So what are you? You're just a guy, right, with an animal. You're not a shomer. You're not responsible. Yeah, you're borrowing it, but you don't have the rules and regulations that the Torah puts on a standard shoel. And in those two words, the Netziv opens up a can of worms to a very, very famous debate that the world of yeshivas love, which is the chakira of what is Bailav Imo all about. I don't think the Netziv meant to say what he said, but when he said that this case of Bailav Imo means that you're not even a shoel, so Rav Chaim has a whole, we're not going to get into it, he has a discussion about a Rambam, who talks about that anytime you are poshea, the reason why a shomer is poshea is because he's a mazik, right? If you're negligent with something, it's tantamount to damaging it. I'm watching a cow, and if I leave the gate open because I forget, that's called pshia. I might as well stab the animal with a knife. It's mazik. It's the same thing. Okay, so that's what the Rambam says. The Raavad doesn't agree because we have a ruling that pshia b'bailim is putter, right? You're even if you have baila vimo and you're posheya, you're not liable. But according to the Rambam, you're always liable because you're not right because you're not posheya. You're a mazik. So forget about pshia, right? You're being a mazik. A mazik should always be chayiv. So how can you say pshia b'bailim putter? So therefore, Rav Chaim explains that what Baila Vimo is all about is that you are not even a shomer anymore. That's why you're putter. The Ketzos argues and says that no, you really are a shomer, but you don't have the same rules as a typical shoel. Obviously, the difference, or as they say, the nafkamina between the two, is whether you have to take a shvua shomer, right? Usually, a shomer chinim will take a shvua to swear that he tried his best and whatever got stolen, but you have to go to court and swear. Well, you only have to take a shvua if you're a shomer. If you're not a shomer, like Rav Chaim would say, then you don't have to take a shvua. So I just wanted to throw that in. I thought that was very good. And we'll end the sugya on that note. I wanted to talk about one unrelated sugya that Rashi stumbles on. There's a discussion about on Sadi Daled Amid Beis about Shvuya, right? It's Geneva Vaveda is one category, and then Nishba, right? And then there's Ones, there's Misa, and then there's Shvuya. Something was captured. So the Gemara has a discussion about how do you know, right, that you're chayiv if it got, that it shows even chayiv if it got captured. So we learn from the word O. And the Gemara brings down a very, very philosophical discussion between two Amoraim, Rav Yonas and Rav Oshia, about how to deal with psukim that list two things, right? For example, the Torah says, Ish asher yikalel es aviv ve'asimo, right? So one of the big prohibitions is cursing your parents. But the Torah says your father or your mother. Now, it's pretty bad if I curse both of them. But what if I curse only one of them? All right. So the Gemara says, how about if I do one? I'm 3 lines from the bottom on 94b. Aviv below imo below aviv minai. And Talmud Lomar aviv imo kilel. Aviv kilel imo kilel. Okay. Rabbi Oshia says because one part of the pasuk has the word av next to the word makalel. One part of the pasuk has the word aim next to the word kalel. So therefore, they're both covered. Rav Yonan says no. Rav Yonasan says, I don't need that way of learning because just because it says two of them, it could be either or, right? What do they call that? Binary? Right? You have to be careful how you say that today. But I said it. Okay, binary, right? It's not binary. It's not one or the other. It's either av or it's either aim, right? The only time the Torah cares that it has to be both is in a very specific situation. Unless the Torah says the magic word yachdav, which in Hebrew means together. Okay? Says Rashi on the top of Tzadei Hey at Aleph, when it comes to the prohibition of plowing with mixed breeds, with a shor and chamor, then I needed the Torah to say the word yachdav. Says Rashi, shamin and di'ilo kasve, if the Torah didn't say yachdav, let's say the Torah said lo sachosh b'shor v'chamor, what would I have thought? I would have thought that I can't even plow with a shor by itself or by a chamor by itself. It has to be both. That's why, I'm sorry, even if I plowed with one of them, That's why it had to say yachtav. So I was looking at that. I said, okay, you know what? This is a very hot topic today, diversity. So I wanted to see how the eyes of halacha are when it comes to this kind of diversity of mixed breed, right? So Rashi brought this up. Okay. So let's, for a little bit, look at this prohibition of kilayim. Okay. We start as we usually do, is look at the pasuk, right? The pasuk is in Kitetse. The pasuk is mentioning different types of kilayim. Now we know there's 5 types of kilayim. Okay, there's kilay begadim, there's kilay zrayim, and there's kilayim of behema. Okay, of animals. So one of the prohibitions, the pasuk says lo sachush b'shor v'chamor yachtav. Okay, the Torah hones in on a shor and chamor. Rashi says hu adin l'chol shnei minim sheba'olam. Okay, now we actually had this at the end of December when we were learning the end of the 5th parak, if you remember, in Bava Kama. The last daf Nun Daled in Bava Kama, spoke about this topic, right? So Rashi brings down that Gemara that says it's not only a shore. If I have 2 different animals, if I have a kangaroo and I have a zebra, okay, leading my wagon, I am chayav on this avera. Any 2 species. Says Rashi, hu adin lahanigam yachad kshurim zugim b'holachat shumasa. It applies to different animals, and it doesn't matter if they are, if you're sitting. It doesn't matter if you're being driven together with them, even if you're not plowing, because the Torah seems to hone in on plowing. But even if you're in the streets, okay, on a ride in Central Park, you are not allowed to have 2 different animals pulling the cart. Okay, so that is Rashi. Of course we're going to look at the Ibn Ezra, because the Ibn Ezra gives a reason. Okay, Rashi doesn't give a reason. The Ibn Ezra gives a reason, and here's what the Ibn Ezra says: davek im hazriya. It's put together with the pasuk before that talks about kilei hakerem, right? There's 2 different types of prohibitions. One is specifically geffen and wheat, and one is any kind of seeds. But we go from seeds to animals to shatnez clothing, right? That's the kilayim that we know today, right? We don't really deal with seeds or with animals. We deal mostly with clothing. So that, to us, we all know that you have to get your clothing checked for shatnez. But the Ibn Ezra says that it's together with Zriya, the Hashem chamal al kol masav. So here's where we're going to get a little deep over here. What's the reason why we can't plow with mixed breeds? Because God has mercy on his creation. Ki ein koach hachamor kekoach hashor. And what's the and? And because God has mercy, he realizes that the shor and the chamor have different capabilities. Period. Then he talks about shatnez, but he doesn't give a therefore. So it's a very odd, so how do you finish a sentence? So you could think about it that, okay, because they're different, they shouldn't be together, right? So thank God we're able to finish a sentence by saying what the Rabbeinu Bechaya explains him to say. Okay? It says Rabbeinu Bechaya, because of Hachacham Rabbi Avraham b'tam mitzvah, ki Hashem chamal al masav, ki en kol chacham k'koach hashor, ulefi dvarav yeh shor v'chamor davka v'lo behemos acheros. So he still doesn't finish the reason, but before we get to the real reason, is he has a problem, because if that's true, then what if you were to find two animals that do have the same koach? And this is the exact problem you have when you're dorish time in dekra. When you give a specific reason and then you find a excuse that the reason doesn't apply, then you're like, okay, now you're stuck. Because if you're telling me the reason why you can't have two different animals is because they have different weight capacities and one is stronger than the other, what if I find two identical animals that are different, but a zoologist could attest that they are able to carry the same burden? So that's his problem. But I think the way the Ibn Ezra would still answer it, aside from the question of Rabbeinu Bechaya, is that I think it's a problem. And again, I don't, I know June and Pride Month and diverse and everything. I don't know the audience really, but I will say the problem when you have different people and of course different animals, but the underlying message over here is that if it's for people, then that's for animals, then it's for people also, that it's not good to group together people with different strengths and different weaknesses. Today we say just the opposite. We want to include and we want this and this, right? We want a cross section of everybody in the same group, right? The Ibn Ezra says 100% the opposite. It's not good because there's no cohesiveness. Everybody has a different, right? Everybody has a different strength, has a different, when it comes to animal, a different physical strength, and the two aren't compatible. So you could see this is very, very controversial, and I'm just bringing it up because, that's what I like to do. And you could make your own conclusion. I will say that the Rabbeinu Bechaya ends because he rejects the Ibn Ezra, right? He says, so what's the reason? Ikar hatam b'mitzvah zu mishum chashash kilayim kishema yavo laharva. It's the classic, well, it may lead to mixed dancing, right? As the joke goes today. Because if they work together, then they will play together. And if they play together, they may mate together. So the way to cut off any potential relationship between two animals that aren't related is for them not even to, as they say, go on the first date. Okay, so therefore you want to distance themselves. The derech over adama, the way farmers work, lahavit simdu el harefet, v'ulai yavo laharba. Again, if they plow together, they'll spend the night together. V'yasu vlados, they'll reproduce. Mishunim ulahakchish ma'ase brachus. Okay, very controversial. He says the problem is when you have this mixed breed, is that, and that's the problem with a mamzer, and the whole. You remember in Parshas, where was it at the end in Vayishlach, where the first mule was created, and whatever it is, you are going against natural creation, and this is an unnatural union. When you have a horse and you have a donkey, okay, it's unnatural, and you are contradicting Ma'ase Brachus. Shenemar limina, liminehu. Okay, so that's the reason of the Rabbeinu Bechaya. The Chezkuni gives a couple of reasons, okay, why you're not allowed to crossbreed and cross-work animals. Again, it's all one thing. You can't have them lead the wagon, and you can't breed them. You can't have them hanging out together. That's the bottom line. Says the Chezkuni, and the Balaturim says something similar. Shahashor malagera tamid v'ochel. The shor is a kosher animal, right? And what do kosher animals do? It chews its cud. The hachamor eno malagera. The chamor does not chew its cud. So what do you think the chamor is going to do? It's going to look at the shor all day long. Nimsha says ochel v'zeh misane. V'zeh tsar b'alechayim. The poor donkey is going to look at the shor, the ox, and say, wow, you're so satisfied. You're eating all day long. You have the best. Meanwhile, it's not really eating. It's just regurgitating and chewing its cud. So this poor donkey is going to be afflicted. And that's called Tsar Balechayim. That's one reason. Okay, we're up to the fourth reason. Davar acher lefisha hashor melach bebehemos. A little Kabbalistic reason. The shore is the king of the animals, right? We thought that the lion was the animal, right? Was the king of the animals. Really, the shore is the melech, va'al demuso kisei hakavod, right? You remember Mari Yecheskel, right? I think the ox is up there. I don't think the donkey made it, right? V'hachamor behema bezuya. The chamor, right? What do we call the chamor in English? Right, we know the answer. So it's the bezuya, right? Am hadom al-chamor. Ve'ein hazivug na'a. It's a bad shidduch. Okay, so he gives that answer also. So there's very, very many reasons. And of course, we're going to look at the chinuch. The chinuch says, what's the reason? So I'm reading from number 550. Okay, that's the number of the lotase. Okay, says the chinuch. And he says it doesn't matter any kind of animals. Achasi tahora, v'achasi tameya, right? So first he starts off by saying any two animals where one is tahor and one is tameh. That's controversial. Not everyone accepts, right? Because that's the paradigm that the Torah uses. The shor is kosher, as we said, and the chamor isn't. So the chinuch at least starts off by saying that. Then he says, he quotes the Rambam, and he says, Shehu mishorish iser habas behema kilayim. This is what they call a siag. You can't have them work together because they may end up mating together. Exactly what Rabbeinu Bachaya said. Right? If they play together, they'll sleep together. Very good. He says, that's what I heard. But and I'll tell you my 2 cents, says the Sefer HaChinuch. V'omer ki mitame mitzvah zu inyan tzar balei chayim shehu asur min haTorah v'yadua sheyesh l'minei habehemus ha'ovos daga gedol lishkonim she'ena minam. Animals, and I saw this with my own eyes when I went on a safari last year for the first time. Animals, right? Birds of a feather, all the expressions that we say, right? All animals, they hang out with each other. They don't really like to mix with other animals. That's just the way it is. Okay? People, different story, but animals stick to their own kind, right? He said it 1,000 years ago from the Sefer HaChinuch, right? He says, Daga Gdola, they get very anxious when they're with other different animals. Could you imagine if they actually had to work together with other animals? The anxiety would be too much. He called Yishkon, right? Birds of a feather stay together. They like to stick with each other. Here we go, right? Diversity. Let's see what he has to say about diversity. We could learn a lesson from the animals. In English, that basically means that two people who are diverse, okay, should not be ordered to perform together the same task because they have different natures and they have different behavior, and it's not going to be a good shidduch. Kumo tzadik v'rasha, v'hanikle v'hanichbad, the one who's honored and the one who's dishonored. She'im ikpida haTorah al atzar sheyesh bazel b'alei chayim she'enan b'nei seichel. Right, ready for this? He ends off by a kal v'chomer. He says, if the Torah went out of its way and cares about animals, okay, that the poor donkey is going to look at the shore and say, oh my God, you're so much better than me. If that's what the Torah is worried about, and these animals have no seichel, could you imagine? Right, you see the punchline already. Kol sheken b'bnei adam asher lahem nefesh maskeles ladas yotzram. Wow, that is an unbelievable kal v'chomer, that if it applies to animals, to only have like kinds together, it applies to people also. I think that's an unbelievable anti-diversity, chant. That's great. And I just want to end off on a beautiful Shir Hashirim Rabbah. Okay, we don't quote this much, if ever. Alma Rav Levi, Kol Ma'asehem Shel Yisrael Mishunim Me'umas Ha'olam. Remember what Haman said? Yeshno Am Echad Mufuzar Mufurad. Jews are different, right? Without getting into the whole shtetl about anti-Semitism, but every person with intelligence will explain to you that the reason why we have been hated all our history is because we are different. So the Shir Hashirim Rabbah says, how are we different? Not why are we different, but how are we different? We're different in the following areas. Again, Kol Maaseh and Shel Yisrael Mishunim Me'umat Ha'olam. B'charishatan, B'zriatan, B'nitiyatan, B'kitziratan, B'imuram, B'dishan, B'garnehem, B'yefehem, B'ganotehem, B'bchorehem, B'bsaram, B'titkalachtan, B'minyanam. All right, I'll read that in English. We are different in the following items: in their plowing, in our sowing, in our planting, in our reaping, in our gathering, in our threshing floors, in our wine press, in our roofs, regarding our firstborns, regarding their flesh, in their shaving, and in their counting. Okay? We are different. What sets us apart in the first example? Remember how we started? Bachari Shatan, in when we're choresh, when we plow, you know how we're different? Shenemar lo sachosh b'shor v'chomor yachdav. We don't crossbreed as opposed to non-Jews. That's what separates us apart. And I just wanted to end on that. There's a whole lot more, but it's 9 o'clock.